Why did the heiresses of the Seagram Empire spend $150 million of daddy's money to turn themselves into criminals running a sex slave camp? For nearly a century, the Bronfman name meant liquid gold, unimaginable wealth and royalty. But Claire and Sarah Bronfman incinerated that legacy. They didn't fund enlightenment. They bankrolled a ring that branded women like cattle. The collapse of the Bronfman dynasty transcends bad investments. It is the story of how a fortune built on the criminal bootlegging of the grandfather was weaponized to fund the sexual slavery of the granddaughters. The catastrophic collapse of the Bronfman dynasty in a criminal courtroom in Brooklyn rooted itself in a timeline nearly a century old. The rot that eventually consumed Claire and Sarah Bronfman did not appear spontaneously in the 2000s. It was encoded in the family DNA, a toxic inheritance passed down from a patriarch who built his castle on a foundation of legal gray areas, ruthless ambition, and proximity to violence. The Seagram building in Manhattan, a monolith of bronze and glass, stands as a monument to legitimate corporate power, but the capital that poured the concrete was generated in the shadows of the Prohibition era. The saga begins with Samuel Bronfman, a man who became known as Mr. Sam, a title that commanded fear and reverence in equal measure, and whose life was a masterclass in the transmutation of criminal opportunity into aristocratic legitimacy. Samuel Bronfman was born in 1889, reportedly on the deck of a ship fleeing the anti-Semitic pogroms of Bessarabia for the icy promise of Canada. This origin story is crucial to the psychological profile of the dynasty. Samuel was a refugee, an outsider in a world dominated by an Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite that viewed him with suspicion. This exclusion forged a chip on his shoulder that hardened into a diamond-like resolve. He craved more than riches. He demanded untouchability. He wanted to build walls of gold so high that the society which rejected him would be forced to look up. The poverty of his early years in the frozen prairies of Manitoba taught him a singular, brutal lesson. Survival requires aggression. While his siblings were content with modest success in the hotel trade, Samuel possessed a predatory intelligence, a mind that could see the hidden architecture of supply and demand before anyone else. The catalyst for the Bronfman Empire was a singular legislative act, the Volstead Act of 1919, which ushered in Prohibition in the United States. For the majority of North America, the banning of alcohol was a moral crusade or a legal inconvenience. For Samuel Bronfman, it was the greatest business opportunity in the history of unbridled capitalism. He analyzed the map and saw what others missed. To the south lay the United States, a market of millions of thirsty consumers suddenly cut off from their supply. To the north lay Canada, where the production of alcohol remained legal for export. Between them lay a border that was thousands of miles long, porous, and impossibly difficult to police. Samuel realized that he didn't need to break Canadian law to become a kingpin. He simply needed to facilitate the breaking of American law. He positioned himself as a distiller and exporter, terms that lent a veneer of respectability to what was, in practice, industrial-scale smuggling. The mechanics of the Bronfman operation in the 1920s were a marvel of logistics and plausible deniability. Samuel established a network of warehouses along the border, particularly in Saskatchewan, and later close to the waterways connecting to the U.S. The genius of his operation was the loophole. Canadian law allowed for the export of liquor to foreign countries. Samuel's trucks and boats would depart with manifests declaring their destination as Cuba, Bermuda, or St. Pierre and Miquelon. In reality, the foreign destination was often a transfer point in the middle of Lake Erie, a shadowy dock in Detroit, or a drop-off in the deep woods of North Dakota where American bootleggers were waiting. Once the liquor left Canadian soil, Samuel washed his hands of it. If it ended up in a speakeasy in Chicago or a jazz club in Harlem, that was the buyer's liability, not the seller's. This legal firewall allowed him to operate with impunity while the streets of America ran with blood. Forensic history reveals that the separation between Samuel Bronfman and the violent American underworld was far thinner than the official corporate biography admits. Supplying the fuel for a continent-wide black market required shaking hands with the men who ran the streets. During the Roaring Twenties, Samuel Bronfman became the primary supplier for some of the most notorious figures in organized crime. While there is no evidence he ever pulled a trigger, his product was the currency of the mob. FBI files and historical records confirm Bronfman liquor fueled the empires of Meyer Lansky, Lucky Luciano, and Al Capone. The Chicago pipeline was essentially a Bronfman franchise. Samuel's relationship with Meyer Lansky is particularly significant to the forensic profile of the family's wealth. Lansky, known as the accountant of the mob, recognized a kindred spirit in Samuel, a man who understood that the real money wasn't in the violence, but in the logistics and the ledger. They were both Jewish immigrants, navigating a violent world, using their intellect to dominate more brutish competitors. The profits were astronomical. By the mid-1920s, while the rest of the world was heading toward the economic abyss of the Great Depression, the Bronfmans were amassing millions in cash. This was dark money, piles of small denomination bills that had to be laundered and legitimized. Samuel used this capital to buy out competitors, consolidating the Canadian distilling industry under his control. In 1924, he founded Distillers Corporation Limited, and in 1928, he acquired Joseph E. Seagram and Sons, a prestigious name that gave his bootlegging operation the stamp of heritage and quality. The genius of Samuel Bronfman lay not just in smuggling, but in his foresight. While other bootleggers were selling rot gut, dangerous unaged alcohol mixed with chemicals, Samuel was obsessed with quality. He was playing the long game. He calculated that Prohibition would not last forever. When the law was inevitably repealed, the American market would open up and consumers would remember the brand that didn't make them blind. He began blending and aging his whiskeys, creating stocks of high-quality spirits like Seagram's VO. He was banking on the future legitimacy of his criminal enterprise. He was effectively aging his reputation alongside his whiskey. When Prohibition ended in 1933, Samuel Bronfman was ready. While his rivals were scrambling to go legit or were being gunned down in gangland wars, Samuel was poised to flood the United States with millions of gallons of perfectly aged legal whiskey. He paid a massive settlement to the U.S. Treasury, millions of dollars in excise taxes, to settle outstanding claims about his wartime imports, which was essentially a retroactive legalization of his bootlegging. With the stroke of a pen and a massive check, the Bootlegger King became a tycoon. Seagram's became the largest distiller in the world. The dark money had been washed clean, transformed into dividends, stock options, and philanthropic foundations. The shadow empire lingered in the psychology of the family. Samuel Bronfman governed his dynasty with the same tyranny he used to rule the whiskey trade. He was a man of volcanic temper, known for brutal public dressings down of subordinates and terrifying rages directed at his children. He constructed a family narrative that demanded absolute loyalty and submission. He viewed his children not as individuals, but as stewards of the fortune he had wrestled from the mud. He was desperate for social acceptance, donating millions to universities, hospitals, and Jewish causes, seeking the knighthood and social standing that the Anglo-Canadian elite constantly denied him. He wanted to be an aristocrat, but in the halls of power, whispers of bootlegger and gangster followed him until his dying day. This psychological complex, the desperate need to be clean, to be noble, while sitting on a mountain of money with dirty origins, is the key to decoding the generational trauma that would later consume his granddaughters. Samuel created a family culture where money was the only metric of value, yet the source of that money was a source of hidden shame. He raised his sons, Edgar Sr. and Charles, in a gilded cage, subjecting them to intense pressure to expand the empire and erase the stain of its birth. He pitted them against each other, fostering a competitive, loveless environment where affection was transactional. The Seagram style was established, opulent, imperious, and secretive. The family headquarters in Montreal was a fortress. They owned private jets, art collections, and real estate, living like modern Medicis. But beneath the surface, the connections to the shadow world remained a part of the lore. Stories circulated about the old days, about the midnight runs across the border, about the suitcases of cash. For the subsequent generations, particularly for Claire and Sarah, who would be born decades later, this history was a double-edged sword. It was the source of their immense privilege, but it was also a moral burden. Decades later, when the predator Keith Raniere would sink his claws into Claire Bronfman, he would weaponize this specific history. He would tell her that her family's fortune was blood money, earned through poisoning people with alcohol and collaborating with murderers. He would convince her that she carried a karmic debt that could only be repaid by funding his humanitarian work. The tragedy of the Bronfman collapse finds its root here in the 1920s. Samuel Bronfman didn't just bottle whiskey, he bottled a toxic legacy of guilt, ruthless accumulation, and moral flexibility. He proved that if you have enough money, you can rewrite history and make the illegal legal. His granddaughter would try to apply the same logic to a sex cult, believing that her wealth made her untouchable, just as it had for Mr. Sam. The transition from the Bootlegger King to the legitimate corporate titan was completed by the 1950s. Samuel Bronfman had successfully integrated himself into the fabric of North American capitalism. Seagram was a blue-chip stock. The family was invited to state dinners, but forensic accounting of the soul suggests that the stain was never truly removed. The empire was built on the exploitation of human vice, addiction to alcohol. It was built on the willingness to circumvent the law for profit. It was built on the philosophy that the end justifies the means. As Samuel aged, his grip on the company tightened, even as he prepared to pass it on. He left his heirs with a massive fortune, but he also left them with a spiritual void. He had spent his life chasing respectability, but he had neglected to build a moral compass for the dynasty. He taught them how to make money, how to crush rivals, and how to buy influence. He did not teach them how to find meaning outside of accumulation. This void, this emptiness at the center of the Bronfman identity, would eventually be filled by a monster. The liquid gold had secured the family's body, but it had done nothing to save their soul. If Samuel Bronfman was the architect of the dynasty, constructing a fortress of wealth and influence from the raw materials of ambition, prohibition, and bootleg spirits, his descendants were the inhabitants of a gilded cage who found themselves trapped by the very walls intended to protect them. By the mid-20th century, the Bronfman name had become North American shorthand for royalty, a brand as potent as the whiskey they distilled. However, forensic psychology teaches that great fortunes often carry a radioactive half-life. The drive required to amass billions rarely survives the genetic transfer to the second and third generations. Instead, what is often passed down is a corrosive mixture of entitlement, aimlessness, and a profound existential hollowness known as dynastic entropy. For Claire and Sarah Bronfman, born into the twilight years of the Seagram Empire, the vast reservoir of family capital did not provide freedom. It provided a paralyzing lack of purpose, creating a vacuum in their lives that would eventually be filled by a predator. The transition of power from the founder to the second generation is a critical juncture in the pathology of any industrial dynasty. Upon Samuel's death in 1971, the mantle of leadership passed to his eldest son, Edgar Bronfman Sr. Unlike his father, who was a rough-hewn street fighter forged in the cold aggression of the Prohibition borderlands and the backroom deals of the underworld, Edgar Sr. was a polished product of ultimate privilege. He was sophisticated, cosmopolitan, and undeniably brilliant, but he lacked the singular predatory focus that had built the company. Under his stewardship, Seagram expanded its footprint, diversifying into oil, chemicals, and eventually acquiring a massive stake in DuPont. The wealth of the family metastasized, reaching levels that made the original bootlegging profits look like pocket change. Edgar Sr. moved in circles that included presidents, prime ministers, and Hollywood moguls. He was the president of the World Jewish Congress, a statesman without a country, wielding the power of a sovereign nation and negotiating with Soviet leaders for the rights of Jews. However, the forensic profile of Edgar Bronfman Sr. reveals a man who was deeply conflicted about his role as a father and whose domestic life was a theater of instability. His personal life was a kaleidoscope of marital chaos. He was married 5 times, including 2 marriages to the same woman, Georgina Webb, the mother of Claire and Sarah. This domestic volatility created a profoundly destabilizing environment for his children. Claire and Sarah, born in the late 1970s, entered the world not as the cherished offspring of a stable home, but as the collateral damage of a high-stakes, high-conflict relationship. They were raised in an atmosphere of unimaginable luxury, private jets to ferry them between estates in England, Sun Valley, and New York, staffs of servants to attend to their every whim, and security details to protect them from kidnappers, but they were emotionally malnourished. Edgar Sr. was an absent god in their lives, a figure of immense power who was rarely physically present and often emotionally inaccessible. His affection was frequently transactional, dispensed through financial allowances rather than emotional connection. He governed his family much like he governed his corporation, with distance, delegation, and an expectation of obedience. This dynamic is crucial to understanding the perfect victim profile that would later define the sisters. They grew up worshiping a father they barely knew, desperate for his validation but terrified of his disapproval. They learned early on that money was the primary language of love and control. To be a Bronfman was to be special, yet within the family hierarchy, Claire and Sarah felt distinctly marginal. They were the children of the second family, often overshadowed by their older half-siblings from Edgar's first marriage, particularly Edgar Jr., who was groomed for succession. This sense of being lesser Bronfmans festered, creating a deep-seated insecurity that no amount of trust fund money could anesthetize. As the 20th century drew to a close, the structural integrity of the Seagram Empire began to fracture, not from external market forces, but from internal hubris and a loss of identity. The catalyst for this dissolution was Edgar Bronfman Jr., the the half-brother of Claire and Sarah. Edgar Jr. was the designated heir apparent, but his heart was never in the liquor business. He viewed the whiskey trade, the liquid gold that had sustained the family for 70 years and survived the Great Depression, as anachronistic, a boring relic of his grandfather's era. He wanted to be a creator. He wrote songs for pop stars and harbored ambitions of being a media mogul. He wanted to trade the grit of industrial distillation for the glamour of Hollywood. In a series of moves that business analysts still study as a masterclass in corporate overreach, Edgar Jr. began to dismantle the Seagram empire to fund his ambitions in the entertainment sector. The climax of this strategic pivot occurred in 2000, a year that marks the spiritual death of the Bronfman dynasty. Edgar Jr. orchestrated the sale of Seagram to the French conglomerate Vivendi Universal. It was an all-stock deal valued at $34 billion. On paper, it looked like a transformation. In reality, it was a liquidation of the family's heritage. The family traded their controlling interest in a stable cash cow business for shares in a volatile media company just as the dot-com bubble was bursting. Within months, the value of Vivendi shares plummeted. The Bronfman family fortune was decimated, losing billions of dollars in paper value. But the loss was not just financial, it was existential. For the first time in nearly a century, the Bronfmans no longer owned the company that bore their name. They were no longer the Seagram Bronfmans. They were just rich people with a lot of cash and no empire. For Claire and Sarah then, in their early 20s, this corporate collapse severed their last tether to a collective identity. They were heiresses to a kingdom that no longer existed. They were awash in liquidity, hundreds of millions of dollars in trust funds that remained untouched by the Vivendi disaster because they were locked away. But they had no North Star. They were drifting in a stratosphere of wealth that isolated them from the realities of human struggle, yet they felt profoundly useless. This creates a specific psychological condition known as affluenza, or wealth fatigue, characterized by a lack of motivation, feelings of guilt, and a desperate, frantic search for meaning. They had been raised to believe their name meant power, but without the company, the name was just a label on a bottle they no longer owned. Forensic analysis of the sisters' personalities during this period reveals the distinct cracks where the darkness would eventually enter. Sarah Bronfman, the older of the pair, was the more socially adept. She was beautiful, outgoing, and projected an image of the carefree socialite. She threw herself into the world of professional show jumping, a sport that is practically designed for the ultra-wealthy, requiring horses that cost as much as houses. However, beneath the equestrian glamour and the smile she wore for photographers, friends and observers described Sarah as flighty, easily influenced, and constantly searching for a guru or a system to explain her life. She was a seeker without a compass, bouncing between fads, diets, and philanthropic causes, looking for something that felt real in a life that felt synthetic. She craved connection but found only people who wanted her money. Claire Bronfman presented a darker, more complex, and more vulnerable profile. She was the shadow to Sarah's light. Physically, she did not fit the mold of the glamorous heiress. She was awkward, shy, and struggled with her weight and appearance in a family that prized aesthetics. She dropped out of high school, a decision that haunted her and fueled a lifelong complex about her intelligence. While the rest of her family was educated at Ivy League institutions or prestigious boarding schools, Claire felt like the dunce of the dynasty. She internalized a narrative of failure. She believed she was unlovable, unintelligent, and unworthy of her name. Her only source of power was her bank account. Yet she resented the money because she felt it was the only reason anyone paid attention to her. This imposter syndrome was acute and debilitating. Claire lived in terror of being exposed as a fraud. She competed in show jumping alongside her sister, but even there, the dynamic was fraught with insecurity. She funded the horses, the stables, the trainers, and the transport, yet she felt she was merely buying her way into the sport rather than earning her place. She possessed a simmering, repressed rage at her absent father who favored his other children, rage at her perfect sister who seemed to glide through life, and rage at a world that she felt mocked her behind her back. She was a woman waiting for permission to be powerful. She was a loaded weapon, waiting for someone to pull the trigger. The relationship between the sisters was intense and codependent. They were united by their shared trauma of parental neglect and their isolation within the rarefied air of the super-rich. They moved through the world as a unit, protecting each other from the perceived judgments of outsiders. But this insularity made them vulnerable. They lacked street smarts. Their entire lives had been mediated by lawyers, accountants, handlers, and staff. They had never learned to judge character because they had never been forced to navigate the world without a safety net. They assumed that because they were Bronfmans, they were invincible. They did not understand that in the predatory ecosystem of the world, a gazelle with a diamond collar is still just a gazelle. In fact, it is a more attractive target. By 2002, the stage was perfectly set for an infection. The sisters were residing in a psychological vacuum. The family business was gone. Their father was aging and distant, focusing on his Jewish advocacy work and his new life. They were sitting on a mountain of cash, approximately $150 million, readily accessible between them, with absolutely no idea what to do with it or with themselves. They were plagued by rich guilt, the gnawing suspicion that they did not deserve their lifestyle and that their wealth was unearned. They wanted to do good, to make a difference, to prove that they were more than just walking checkbooks. They were desperate for a cause that would give them the moral authority they lacked. Cults and coercive control groups rarely target the weak. They target the lost. They target individuals who have high aspirations but low self-esteem, people who feel a gap between who they are and who they think they should be. Keith Raniere, the man who would destroy them, didn't have to break into the Bronfman vault. The sisters unlocked the door and invited him in. They were looking for a father figure who would actually pay attention to them. They were looking for a teacher who would tell them they were smart. They were looking for a structure that would impose order on their chaotic, aimless lives. They wanted to be stripped of the burden of choice. The generational curse of the Bronfmans was not a supernatural hex. It was the inevitable result of a legacy built on secrets and emotional distance. Samuel Bronfman had laundered his money, but he hadn't laundered the family dynamics. The ruthlessness he used to build Seagram had mutated into the emotional coldness of Edgar Sr., which in turn mutated into the desperate vulnerability of Claire and Sarah. The family had spent 80 years building walls to keep the world out, but they had forgotten to check if the foundation was rotting. The very insulation that money provided prevented them from developing the immune system necessary to detect a con artist. The sisters began to drift away from the traditional high society of New York and Montreal. They stopped attending the galas. They lost interest in the charity balls. They started attending self-help workshops, seeking answers in the New Age marketplace. They were primed for radicalization. They were tired of being treated like ATMs by fake friends. They wanted to be treated like warriors by a true leader. They did not know it yet, but they were about to meet a man who would validate their deepest insecurities and weaponize their greatest asset, their inheritance, against them. The void left by the sale of Seagram was vast. It was a billion-dollar hole in the center of their identity, and nature abhors a vacuum. Into this empty space stepped the philosophy of executive success programs, the recruiting arm of NXIVM. The tragedy of this era is the tragedy of wasted potential. Claire and Sarah Bronfman had the resources to cure diseases, to fund arts, to change the world for the better. They could have been the next great philanthropists. Instead, their upbringing had left them so psychologically porous that they were willing to burn it all down just to hear someone say, "I see you." The psychological terrain of the Bronfman sisters in the early 2000s was a desert, parched for meaning. They were wealthy beyond comprehension, yet spiritually bankrupt. They were the daughters of a king, but they felt like orphans. This dissonance created a deafening internal noise, a constant anxiety that they were wasting their lives. When Keith Raniere arrived, he did not offer them money. They had plenty of that. He offered them something far more valuable and far more dangerous. He offered them a purpose. He offered to fill the void. And for that privilege, they would hand over not just their fortune, but their souls. The liquid gold of their grandfather's era had turned into a poisoned chalice, and they were about to drink it to the dregs. The dynasty was not conquered by a rival corporation or a market crash. It was hollowed out by its own children, who were starving for meaning in a world made of money. By 2002, the stage was set for a collision that would dismantle the Bronfman legacy. On one side stood Claire and Sarah Bronfman, two young women adrift in a sea of unearned capital, burdened by the weight of their surname and starving for a purpose that their hollow socialite existence could not provide. On the other side stood Keith Raniere, a man who occupied the absolute inverse of their world. While the Bronfmans lived in the rarefied air of Manhattan penthouses and equestrian estates, Raniere operated out of a nondescript strip mall in Albany, New York. He possessed no pedigree, no fortune, and no legitimate institutional power. Yet within a few short years, this man would colonize the minds of the billionaire heiresses so completely that they would willingly dismantle their own family to serve him. The infiltration of the Bronfman dynasty resembled a psychological hijacking rather than a hostile corporate takeover, a forensic case study in how a predator uses a victim's deepest insecurities to turn them into a weapon against themselves. Keith Raniere, known to his followers as Vanguard, presented a profile that was disarmingly anti-corporate. He did not wear the bespoke suits of the men Claire and Sarah were accustomed to, the bankers, lawyers, and titans of industry who populated their father's world. Instead, Raniere cultivated the aesthetic of the eccentric genius. He wore baggy volleyball shorts, old t-shirts, and sneakers. He kept his hair long and unkempt, framing a face behind wire-rimmed glasses that suggested a mind too preoccupied with higher thoughts to care about earthly vanity. This visual presentation was a calculated tactic. To the Bronfman sisters, who had grown up in a world of rigid formality and superficial appearances, Raniere's slovenliness read as authenticity. It signaled that he was operating on a plane of existence where material things did not matter, an intoxicating proposition for two women who felt imprisoned by their material wealth. Raniere's primary weapon was his own mythology. He claimed to have an IQ of 240, a score that would make him one of the smartest human beings in history. He claimed to be a concert-level pianist, a judo champion, and a scientist who had cracked the code of human potential. Forensic psychiatrists describe this as malignant narcissism coupled with a messianic complex. But to the lost souls who drifted into his orbit, it was gospel. He founded ENXIVM, not as a religion, but as a scientific enterprise dedicated to unlocking human potential through a curriculum called Executive Success Programs. The language was corporate, the structure was multi-level marketing, but the mechanism was pure coercive control. Sarah Bronfman was the first to fall. In 2002, searching for direction after a failed marriage and a general sense of malaise, she attended an ESP intensive. These were grueling multi-day workshops that ran for 12 to 14 hours a day. The environment was carefully engineered to break down psychological defenses. The rooms were kept cold, participants were deprived of sleep and subjected to a relentless barrage of what experts call word salad, circular hypnotic language that sounds profound but is ultimately meaningless. Raniere and his top lieutenants, including Nancy Salzman, would speak for hours about ethics, value, and parasitic nature. They used a technique known as neuro-linguistic programming to alter the participants' perception of reality. For Sarah, a woman who had always felt adrift, the structure of ESP was addictive. It offered a clear hierarchy, a system of colored sashes that denoted rank, and a community that love-bombed her with validation. For the first time, she wasn't just Edgar Bronfman's daughter. She was a student on the path to enlightenment. Once Sarah was captured, she became the primary vector of infection for Claire. This is a standard recruitment pattern in cult dynamics. Use the family bond to pull in the higher value target. Claire Bronfman was the ultimate prize for Raniere. She was wealthier than Sarah, but more importantly, she was psychologically more fragile. Claire carried the deep wound of feeling intellectually inferior. She had dropped out of high school, struggled with learning disabilities, and lived in terror of being exposed as stupid. Raniere, the self-proclaimed smartest man in the world, identified this insecurity with the precision of a shark smelling blood in the water. When Claire finally attended an intensive, Raniere did not treat her like a celebrity or a cash cow. He treated her like a diamond in the rough. He sat with her for hours, engaging her in dense philosophical conversations. He listened to her. This was the critical deviation from her family dynamic. Edgar Bronfman Sr. was a man who spoke at people, a titan who commanded rooms. Raniere spoke to Claire. He validated her intellect. He told her that her insecurities were not flaws, but symptoms of a society that didn't understand her unique genius. He convinced her that her lack of formal education was actually an asset because her mind hadn't been polluted by the mainstream system. In doing so, he effectively replaced Edgar Sr. as the primary paternal figure in her life. He gave her what her father never could, his undivided attention and his approval. But the indoctrination went deeper than mere flattery. Raniere began to dismantle Claire's moral compass using a sophisticated form of gaslighting. He targeted the source of her rich guilt, the Seagram fortune. Raniere spun a narrative that weaponized the family's history. He invoked the legacy of Samuel Bronfman, the bootlegger. He told Claire that the money she lived on was blood money, accumulated through the exploitation of addiction and criminal enterprise. He argued that this tainted wealth had created a karmic debt that was responsible for her unhappiness and lack of purpose. This was a masterstroke of manipulation. He took her greatest source of shame and offered a solution. He told her that she could cleanse the money by using it to fund NXIVM's humanitarian mission. By giving her millions to him, she wasn't just spending money, she was engaging in an act of moral atonement. She was purifying her soul by bankrupting her trust fund. As Claire fell deeper into the NXIVM rabbit hole, Raniere initiated the isolation phase. A cult cannot function if the subject has strong tethers to the outside world, particularly to authoritative figures who might challenge the leader's dominance. For Claire, that figure was her father, Edgar Bronfman Sr. Raniere began to paint Edgar not just as a distant father, but as a suppressive person, a term borrowed from Scientology but adapted for NXYVM. He characterized Edgar as the embodiment of the old world establishment, a man who used his power to control and crush the human spirit. He convinced Claire that her father's disapproval of NXIVM wasn't concern for her well-being, but proof that he was threatened by her growth. He told her that Edgar wanted to keep her small, weak, and dependent. This psychological wedge was driven in with relentless force. Raniere created a binary reality for Claire. There was the ethical world of NXIVM, led by Vanguard, and the corrupt world of the Bronfmans, led by Edgar. Claire had to choose, and because Raniere had successfully linked her self-worth to his approval, she chose Vanguard. The shift was radical. Claire went from being a shy, insecure equestrian to being a fanatical defender of Keith Raniere. She began to view her family through a lens of paranoia and hostility. She saw her father's attempts to intervene, not as love, but as attacks. The turning point, the moment where psychological manipulation transformed into criminal action, occurred when Claire crossed the line into corporate espionage against her own flesh and blood. Raniere, paranoid that Edgar Bronfman Sr. would use his influence to destroy NXIVM, convinced Claire that she needed to protect the organization by any means necessary. He told her that her father was part of a Luciferian network, or a global conspiracy aimed at destroying light and truth. Under Raniere's direction, Claire authorized and funded a cyber intelligence operation against her father. Using her access and her money, Claire facilitated the hiring of computer experts to hack into the email accounts of Edgar Bronfman Sr. and his associates at the World Jewish Congress. This was not a teenage prank, it was a federal crime. They installed keyloggers, software that records every keystroke on computers to monitor his communications. Claire Bronfman, the daughter of one of the most powerful Jewish leaders in the world, was spying on him for a strip mall guru in Albany. This act was the ultimate patricide. It signified that the psychological hijack was complete. She had not only rejected her father's authority, she had declared war on him. She was using the money he gave her to pay for the weapons to destroy him. The transformation of Claire Bronfman was terrifying to behold for those who knew her. She became hard, cold, and litigious. Raniere anointed her as the enforcer of the cult. Because she was the one with the money, she held power over other members. She began to emulate Raniere's cruelty. The woman who had felt bullied all her life became the bully. She used her fortune to silence critics, hiring high-priced lawyers to bury journalists and former members in lawsuits. She famously said, "I will spend my last dime to protect Keith." This was not hyperbole. She burned through millions of dollars paying for Raniere's legal defenses, his private investigators, and his whims. She funded his commodities trading experiments, losing over $60 million in a single year, yet she never wavered. When she lost the money, Raniere blamed her deficiencies and her fear, and she apologized to him for losing her own fortune. The level of cognitive dissonance required to apologize to the man who squandered your inheritance is staggering, but it is a testament to the totality of Raniere's control. Sarah, while less aggressive than Claire, was equally captured. She became the face of the cult's humanitarian front, organizing events like Humanity Week and inviting VIPs to lend credibility to Raniere. She was the velvet glove to Claire's iron fist. Together, the sisters provided the two things Raniere lacked: legitimacy, and liquidity. Without the Bronfman name, NXIVM was just a weird basement group. With the Bronfman name, it was a movement that could attract actresses, doctors, and scientists. The infiltration was insidious because it was consensual. Claire and Sarah were not kidnapped. They were seduced by an idea. They were seduced by the idea that they were special, that they were chosen, and that they alone had the vision to save the world. Raniere played on their Messiah complex. He told them that their wealth was a tool given to them by destiny to usher in a new age of ethics. He made them feel essential. In the Seagram empire, they were redundant heirs. In NXIVM, they were generals in a spiritual war. By 2008, the psychological hijack was total. The Bronfman sisters had largely severed ties with their former lives. They had moved to Albany to be closer to Vanguard. They were living in a reality tunnel constructed entirely by Keith Raniere. In this tunnel, up was down, slavery was freedom, and theft was charity. The infiltration of evil was not just about the money they gave. It was about the identity they surrendered. They had allowed a parasite to burrow into the empty spaces of their souls, and that parasite was now driving the host. The most tragic aspect of this phase was the complete inversion of the Bronfman legacy. Samuel Bronfman had spent his life trying to build a name that commanded respect. Claire Bronfman was now spending that name to protect a man who branded women. She had taken the shadow empire of her grandfather and brought it into the digital age, trading bootlegged whiskey for trafficked humans. The shadow was no longer a metaphor. It was the reality in which she lived. She had become the banker of a criminal enterprise, convinced she was the patron saint of a revolution. The trap was shut. The billion-dollar void had been filled with darkness, and the sisters were now ready to enforce that darkness on others. By the mid-2000s, the metamorphosis of Claire Bronfman was complete. The awkward, insecure equestrian who had stumbled into the NXIVM orbit searching for a sense of purpose had been effectively erased from existence. In her place stood a woman hardened by indoctrination, fueled by a fanatical devotion to Keith Raniere, and armed with a weapon more destructive than any physical arsenal, a seemingly bottomless reservoir of liquid capital. This era of the Bronfman tragedy is not a story of passive victimization. It is a chronicle of active malicious agency. It documents the rise of the enforcer, a dark period where the Seagram fortune, money originally minted in the bootlegging violence of the 1920s, was repurposed into an engine of modern legal and financial warfare. Claire Bronfman went far beyond funding a self-help group, effectively financing a private intelligence agency and a litigation machine designed to hunt down, silence, and economically annihilate anyone who dared to speak the truth about Vanguard. The sheer scale of Claire Bronfman's destruction stemmed from a radical psychological shift. Under Keith Raniere's tutelage, Claire had internalized a binary worldview where Raniere represented the pinnacle of human ethics and his critics represented suppressive evil. In this warped moral landscape, destroying Raniere's enemies was not a crime, it was a virtuous act of protection. Raniere, a master manipulator who despised the constraints of the legal system but loved to exploit its loopholes, recognized that Claire's money gave him a superpower, the ability to outspend anyone. He designated Claire as his hammer. While Sarah Bronfman drifted into the softer diplomatic roles of the cult, organizing conferences and courting dignitaries, Claire was deployed to the front lines of the dirty war. She found a dark, intoxicating power in this role. For a woman who had spent her life feeling invisible and intellectually inferior to her father and sister, The ability to command armies of high-priced lawyers and private investigators provided a rush of agency. She was no longer the ugly duckling of the Bronfman dynasty. She was the gatekeeper of the Messiah, and she wielded her checkbook like a sword. The primary theater of this war was the American judicial system. Claire Bronfman pioneered a strategy of litigation terrorism, a scorched earth tactic designed not necessarily to win cases on their merits, but to bleed opponents dry through the procedural brutality of the legal system. Her target list was extensive, ranging from journalists and cult experts to former members who had defected. She operated on a principle of asymmetric warfare. She had infinite resources, while her targets were often middle-class individuals with mortgages and families. She knew that the process was the punishment. The most prominent and protracted example of this warfare was the campaign against Rick Ross, a deprogrammer and cult specialist who had been one of the first to identify NXIVM as a dangerous coercive control group. Ross had published psychological analyses of Raniere's methods on his website, analyzing the similarities between NXIVM's rational inquiry and classic brainwashing techniques. In the eyes of Raniere, Ross was an existential threat who had to be obliterated. In the eyes of Claire Bronfman, Ross was a target to be destroyed, and she wrote the checks to make it happen. For 14 years, Claire funded a relentless legal assault on Rick Ross. She hired high-end corporate law firms, paying them millions of dollars to file lawsuit after lawsuit against him, often on frivolous grounds ranging from copyright infringement to trade secret violations. The legal theory was thin, claiming that by quoting NXIVM materials to criticize them, Ross had violated intellectual property rights, but the legal reality was crushing. Claire directed her lawyers to file endless motions, demand extensive discovery, and schedule depositions in inconvenient locations. The strategy was explicit: attrition. Claire knew that Ross could not afford to defend himself against the endless barrage. She aimed to bankrupt him, to force him to take down his website and recant his criticism simply to survive financially. Forensic accounting of this vendetta reveals that Claire spent upwards of $5 million purely on the persecution of Rick Ross. This figure is staggering when one considers the outcome. She eventually lost most of the legal battles, but in her mind, the money was well spent because it kept Ross occupied, stressed, and financially crippled for over a decade. It was weaponized philanthropy. She was donating her fortune to the cause of censorship. At the height of the litigation, Ross described the psychological toll of waking up every day knowing that a billionaire heiress was dedicated to his destruction. Claire's obsession with Ross was so absolute that she even authorized private investigators to dig into his trash and monitor his communications, looking for any leverage that could be used to blackmail or discredit him. But the legal war was not limited to outside critics. The wrath of the Bronfman legal army was turned most viciously against defectors, the people Raniere labeled Luciferians or suppressives. When a group of high-ranking members, known as the Nekvim 9, left the organization in 2009, citing concerns about Raniere's behavior and financial irregularities, Claire went on the offensive. She did not just sue them, she hunted them. Claire hired a phalanx of private investigators, including a firm called Canapari and the notorious consultant Joseph O'Hara. These investigators were not tasked with finding the truth. They were tasked with finding dirt. They rifled through the defectors' trash, obtained their phone records through pretexting, and stalked their families. They built dossiers on anyone who left, looking for financial improprieties, sexual affairs, or anything that could be weaponized in court or the court of public opinion. In one of the most chilling episodes of legal manipulation, Claire Bronfman orchestrated a campaign against Joseph O'Hara after he switched sides. O'Hara, a rugged political operative who had initially been hired to help NXIVM, realized the organization was a criminal enterprise and attempted to expose it. In retaliation, Claire used her connections and her funds to manipulate the outcome of local prosecutions in Albany. She effectively weaponized the district attorney's office against her private enemy, leading to O'Hara being indicted on charges related to NXIVM funds, charges that were eventually dismissed, but not before O'Hara's life was upended. This incident demonstrated that Claire was not merely a passive financier. She was an active participant in the corruption of the justice system. She believed her money placed her above the law and gave her the right to use the state as her personal enforcement arm. The ferocity of these attacks sent a chilling message to anyone inside the cult who harbored doubts. If you leave, Claire will destroy you. She became the prison warden of NXIVM. Members stayed not just because they loved Keith, but because they were terrified of Claire. She had proven that she would spend $10 to exact $1 of damage, a calculus of vengeance that no rational person could compete with. While the legal battles raged in the open courtrooms of New York and New Jersey, a darker financial crime was unfolding in the shadows of the global markets. Claire Bronfman was not merely a donor. She was the chief financial officer of a criminal enterprise. NXIVM's financial structure was a labyrinth of shell companies, trusts, and LLCs designed to hide Keith Raniere's assets from the IRS and his creditors. Raniere, who prided himself on owning nothing in his own name, lived entirely on the largesse of the Bronfman sisters. Claire paid for his food, his clothes, his travel, and the upkeep of his harem. But her role went beyond paying the bills. She engaged in complex money laundering operations to obscure the source and destination of the funds, using the Bronfman Trust as a washing machine for the cult's expenses. However, the most staggering example of financial abuse and the clearest evidence of Raniere's total psychological colonization of Claire was the commodities trading disaster. This episode serves as the definitive forensic proof of her enslavement. Keith Raniere, in his delusions of grandeur, believed he had solved the mathematical code of the global markets. He convinced Claire that he could generate infinite wealth to fund their humanitarian world-saving missions by trading commodities, specifically gold and corn futures. He claimed to have developed a proprietary algorithm based on his rational inquiry philosophy that removed the risk from gambling. Claire, believing him to be the smartest man in the world and desperate to prove her worth to him, gave him unrestricted access to her accounts. She opened trading lines with millions of dollars in margin. The result was a financial bloodbath of historic proportions. Raniere did not trade with the caution of an investor. He gambled with the reckless abandon of an addict playing with house money. He would stay up all night, executing trades that defied all market logic, averaging down on losing positions in the arrogant belief that the market would eventually bend to his will because he was vanguard. It didn't. Over a period of roughly 2 years, Keith Raniere lost approximately $65 million of Claire Bronfman's money. To put this number in perspective, it is a fortune that exceeds the lifetime earnings of most CEOs. It was a significant chunk of her entire inheritance, money that had taken the Bronfman family 3 generations to accumulate. In any normal relationship, a loss of this magnitude would lead to a lawsuit, a criminal investigation, or at the very least, a severing of ties. But in the coercive control dynamic of NXIVM, the reaction was inverted. When the losses were revealed, Raniere did not apologize. Instead, he gaslit Claire with a cruelty that is difficult to comprehend. He told her that the algorithm was perfect, but her fear-based energy and lack of spiritual discipline had infected the trades. He convinced her that the money was lost because she wasn't integrated enough, that her doubts and insecurities had physically manifested in the market fluctuations. The forensic evidence of this psychological servitude is a letter Claire wrote to Raniere after the loss. Instead of screaming at him, she apologized. She wrote words to the effect of, "I am sorry for letting my fear ruin your work." She accepted responsibility for his incompetence. This moment is the psychological event horizon of the Bronfman tragedy. It demonstrates that Claire had been hollowed out completely. Her reality was entirely dictated by Raniere. She essentially thanked him for incinerating her birthright. This $65 million loss also served a strategic purpose for Raniere. It locked Claire in. Known in psychology as the sunk cost fallacy, but operating here on a sociopathic scale, Raniere knew that if Claire left him, she would have to admit to herself and the world that she lost $65 million. Loss also served a strategic purpose for Raniere. It locked Claire in. Known in psychology as the sunk cost fallacy, but operating here on a sociopathic scale, Raniere knew that if Claire left him, she would have to admit to herself and the world that she lost $65 million to a con man. The cognitive dissonance of that realization would be too shattering to bear. If she stayed, however, she could maintain the illusion that the loss was a tuition fee for a greater lesson, part of a grander plan that would eventually pay off. She doubled down, becoming even more fanatical to justify the price she had paid. She had bought her ticket to hell, and it was so expensive that she refused to get off the ride. But Claire's criminality was not limited to white-collar financial maneuvering or courtroom bullying. She was deeply implicated in the human trafficking infrastructure of the cult. As NXIVM expanded into Mexico, recruiting the children of the political elite, the organization began to move women across the border to Albany to serve Raniere. These women were often brought in on tourist visas but were put to work for the company or sexually exploited by Raniere. When their visas expired, they became vulnerable to deportation, a vulnerability Raniere exploited to keep them compliant. Claire Bronfman stepped in to solve this logistical problem with criminal pragmatism. She engaged in visa fraud to keep Raniere's harem in the country. She helped falsify documents, claiming these women had specialized skills or were employed in legitimate management roles within the company, when in reality they were uncompensated servants and sexual partners. She harbored undocumented immigrants, using her properties in upstate New York as holding pens. The Rainbow Cultural Garden, a NXIVM-run educational program for children that spanned multiple countries, was used as a cover for moving people and money across borders. Claire's involvement here was visceral and direct. She wasn't just signing checks. She was coordinating the movement of human bodies. She was the logistics manager of a trafficking ring, using the veneer of her high society status to deflect suspicion from immigration authorities. She treated these women not as humans, but as assets to be managed for the pleasure of Vanguard. If a woman caused trouble or tried to leave, Claire would threaten to have her deported, weaponizing the state once again to enforce the cult's will. The cruelty of Claire Bronfman during this period extended to her own family, marking the final stage of her moral decay. The patricide, the weaponized fortune, was turned inward against the man who created it. In the years leading up to the death of her father, Edgar Bronfman Sr., Claire remained estranged, viewing him through the lens of Raniere's paranoia. Raniere had convinced her that Edgar was the head of a Luciferian cabal intent on destroying NXIVM. Under Raniere's direction, Claire authorized and funded a cyber intelligence operation against her father. Using her money, NXIVM hired hackers to install keyloggers, software that records every keystroke, on the computers of Edgar Bronfman Sr. and his associates at the World Jewish Congress. They monitored his emails, his passwords, and his private correspondence. This was not just a violation of privacy, it was a federal crime. Claire Bronfman was spying on her dying father for a strip mall guru. She had completely severed the bond of blood. When Edgar Sr. passed away in 2013, Claire did not retreat into mourning or reflection. She accelerated her activities. The death of the patriarch removed the last potential check on her behavior. With Edgar Sr. gone, there was no one left with the power or influence to intervene. Claire was now fully unmoored, a rogue satellite spinning wildly in Raniere's gravity, consuming the remaining inheritance to feed the black hole of the cult. One of the most disturbing aspects of Claire's role as the enforcer was her complicity in the systematic extortion of members. To ensure loyalty, Raniere instituted a policy of collateral. Members, particularly those in the inner circle, were required to hand over damaging material, nude photos, confessions of past crimes, financial dirt on their families to the organization. This collateral was held as an insurance policy. If a member tried to leave or speak out, the collateral would be released to the public or the authorities. Claire Bronfman was aware of this system. In fact, her legal team often held the keys to the vault where these secrets were kept. She used her legal aggression to remind potential defectors that she not only had the money to sue them, but she had the dirt to ruin their reputations. She created a surveillance state within the cult where fear of exposure was reinforced by the fear of litigation. She was the keeper of the secrets, the librarian of shame. Claire Bronfman was not a drooling zombie. She was highly competent, organized, and relentless. She attended board meetings, directed legal strategy, and managed complex financial transfers. This dichotomy is what makes her crime so chilling. She applied the business acumen she had inherited from the Bronfman lineage to the maintenance of a cult. She ran NXIVM like a Fortune 500 company. But the product was abuse. By 2015, Claire had effectively built a fortress around Keith Raniere. She had silenced his critics with lawsuits. She had funded his lifestyle with millions. She had facilitated the transport of his victims. She had insulated him from the consequences of his actions. She believed she was building a utopia, but in reality, she was financing a dungeon. Her fortune, earned from the liquid gold of Seagram's whiskey, had been transmuted into the iron bars of a cage. She had become the warden of NXIVM, a role she performed with a terrifying bureaucratic efficiency. The tragedy of the weaponized fortune is that the money Samuel Bronfman made by defying the law was ultimately used by his granddaughter to pervert the law. Samuel used his bootlegging profits to buy legitimacy. Claire used her legitimate inheritance to fund criminality. It was a complete inversion of the American dream. Instead of money providing freedom, it provided the means to enslave others. As the lawsuits piled up and the bank accounts drained, Claire Bronfman stood amidst the wreckage, convinced she was a martyr for a righteous cause. She did not see that she had become the very thing her grandfather had spent his life trying to escape, a gangster. But the darkness was about to deepen. The financial and legal terror Claire inflicted was merely the perimeter defense for something far more horrific growing at the center of the organization. With the critics silenced and the money flowing, Keith Raniere was emboldened to unleash his ultimate fantasy. The enforcer had cleared the way for the master. The stage was now set for the final descent into madness, the creation of DOS, the branding of human flesh, and the ultimate revelation of what Claire Bronfman had been protecting all along. The narrative of the Bronfman dynasty's collapse has, until this point, been defined by the abstract violence of white-collar crime, the theft of inheritance, the destruction of reputations through litigation, and the erasure of identity through psychological manipulation. However, as the timeline moves into 2015 and 2016, the nature of the crime shifts radically. The abstract becomes visceral, the psychological becomes surgical. The financial fortress that Claire Bronfman built around Keith Raniere did not merely protect a con man, it incubated a monster who was no longer satisfied with owning the minds and bank accounts of his followers. He now demanded their flesh. The horror inside the Albany townhouses relied entirely on the structure of DOS. The acronym stands for Dominus Obsequious Sororium, a butchered Latin phrase roughly translating to master over slave women. While NXIVM presented itself to the world as a glossy executive coaching program, DOS was a secret society hidden deep within its core, a black box inside a black box. It was structured as a pyramid scheme of slavery. At the top sat the Grandmaster, Keith Raniere, though his involvement was strictly concealed from the lower-level recruits. Below him were his first-line masters, most notably the actress Allison Mack, who had transitioned from a star of the Superman show Smallville to Raniere's primary recruiter and grooming partner. These masters recruited their own slaves, who in turn were encouraged to recruit their own slaves, creating a downstream flow of abuse where women were victimized by other women, all for the ultimate gratification of the invisible man at the apex. The genius of DOS and its supreme cruelty lay in its marketing. It was sold to potential victims not as a sex cult, but as a feminist boot camp. Allison Mack targeted women who were already deep in NXIVM, women like India Oxenberg, who were looking for the next level of discipline and growth. Mack pitched DOS as a secret sorority, a safe space where women could help other women overcome their weaknesses, their narcissism, and their physical limitations. It was framed as an elite special forces training for the soul. The trap was baited with the promise of empowerment. These women were told that their comfort was their enemy and that true strength could only be found through total submission and the conquering of pain. However, the price of admission to this sorority was the surrender of free will, codified through a mechanism known as collateral. Before a recruit could even hear the name of the group or know its true purpose, she was required to provide destructive material to her recruiter. This collateral was not symbolic, it was nuclear. Women were coerced into handing over compromising, intimate photographs, videos of themselves confessing to crimes they hadn't committed, deeds to their homes, and financial information that could ruin their families. In the case of India Oxenberg, the collateral included sensitive information about her celebrity family. This material was uploaded to a cloud server controlled by the masters. The recruits were told that if they ever left the group, revealed its secrets, or disobeyed a command, the collateral would be released. Forensic psychology identifies this as the moment of psychological entrapment. Once the collateral is sent, the victim is no longer a volunteer. She is a hostage. The lock clicks shut. The women of DOS were effectively blackmailing themselves, handing the keys to their destruction to Allison Mack and, by extension, Keith Raniere. With the collateral secured, the training began. The physical regimen imposed on the slaves of DOS was a manifestation of Keith Raniere's specific sexual and aesthetic pathologies. Raniere publicly preached about health, but privately he fetishized emaciation. He expressed a revulsion for female body fat, claiming it interfered with a woman's energy level. Consequently, the women of DOS were placed on starvation diets that would be classified as torture under the Geneva Convention. They were restricted to 500 to 800 calories a day. To put this in perspective, this is the caloric intake of a toddler. Yet it was imposed on grown women who were expected to run, work, and serve Raniere around the clock. The physiological effects of this starvation were rapid and devastating. The women stopped menstruating, a condition known as amenorrhea, which Raniere reportedly celebrated as a sign that they had evolved beyond their animal nature. Their hair began to fall out. They suffered from constant vertigo, brain fog, and extreme fatigue. This physical deterioration served a strategic purpose. A starving brain is incapable of critical thought or rebellion. The hunger kept them in a state of constant, desperate focus on the next meal or the next command. They were required to document every bite of food and send photos to their masters for approval. If they exceeded their calorie limit, they were punished with physical penance, such as cold showers, standing in the snow barefoot, or being forced to perform acts of self-denial. Allison Mack, once a vibrant and healthy actress, withered away to a skeletal frame, viewing her anorexia as a badge of spiritual purity. But the starvation was merely the preparation for the ultimate violation. By 2016, Keith Raniere had decided that psychological ownership was insufficient. He wanted a permanent physical claim on his property. He conceived of a ritual that would bind the women to him forever, a ritual that borrowed from the practices of cattle ranching, branding. The branding ceremonies took place in a townhouse in Knox Woods, a quiet suburban development in Albany. The banality of the setting makes the horror of the events even more jarring. This was not a dungeon in a Gothic castle. It was a seemingly normal home, likely secured or subsidized through the financial ecosystem that Claire Bronfman had established. The ceremony was shrouded in ritualistic secrecy. The victims, usually in groups of 3 or 4, were told they were receiving a tattoo that would symbolize the 4 elements. They were driven to the house, told to disrobe, and led into a room that had been prepared like a medical theater, albeit one devoid of sterile mercy. The executioner of this ritual was Dr. Danielle Roberts, a licensed osteopathic physician and a devout follower of Raniere. Roberts had violated the most sacred tenet of medicine, primum non nocere, to serve the whims of the vanguard. She was not wielding a tattoo gun, which deposits ink into the skin with needles. She was wielding a cauterizing pen, a medical device designed to burn through tissue to stop bleeding during surgery. This device heats up to temperatures exceeding 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit. It is designed to destroy flesh, not to decorate it. The procedure was a nightmare of coerced consent and physical restraint. The victim was instructed to lie on a massage table. Because the pain of cauterization without anesthesia is excruciating, a burning sensation that triggers the body's deepest panic reflexes. The victim had to be physically restrained. This was not done with ropes, but by the other slaves. In a twisted display of sisterhood, the other women would hold down the victim's arms and legs, chanting, "Master, please, brand me. It would be an honor." This chant was a required part of the ritual, a verbal contract spoken through tears and terror, designed to absolve Raniere of legal liability. As Dr. Roberts applied the red-hot tip of the cauterizing pen to the sensitive skin of the pelvic region. The room filled with the sickening, distinct smell of burning human flesh and hair. Witnesses later described this smell as the most traumatizing aspect of the ordeal, a primal scent that signaled deep biological damage. The women screamed. They shook uncontrollably. The procedure took between 20 to 30 minutes for each woman, as Roberts had to carve the lines deep enough to create a permanent keloid scar. This was not a quick stamp. It was a slow, deliberate carving. The horror of the branding was compounded by the deception of the symbol itself. The women were told it was a geometric symbol representing the elements. However, forensic analysis of the image reveals a narcissistic secret hidden in plain sight. If the image is rotated 90 degrees, the geometric lines clearly resolve into two sets of initials, KR and AM. The letters K and R are the dominant framework, with the letters A and M woven into the side. These women were not being marked with a spiritual symbol. They were being tagged with the initials of their owners. They were human cattle walking billboards for Keith Raniere's ego. They would carry his name on their skin for the rest of their lives, a permanent reminder of their subjugation. While Claire Bronfman was not present in the room during the brandings, Raniere kept the money separate from the flesh to protect his bankroll. Her culpability is woven into the DNA of the crime. The DOS sorority could not have existed without the permissive environment Claire created. Her money paid for the townhouses where the slaves slept. Her money paid for the food they ate. Her money paid for the legal intimidation that kept their families at bay. More directly, forensic evidence suggests Claire was aware of the group's existence and attempted to join, though she was reportedly deemed too difficult or too high maintenance for the initial slave cohort. However, her role as the enforcer was vital to DOS. She was the looming threat. Every woman on that table knew that if they ran, they wouldn't just face the release of their collateral, they would face the Bronfman legal army. Claire was the electrified fence around the plantation. The psychological state of the DOS slaves post-branding was one of total zombie-like dissociation. They were sleep-deprived, starving, and traumatized by the pain of the ritual. Yet, they were forced to thank Raniere for the privilege of being branded. They were required to ask for permission to sleep. They were required to be readiness compliant, meaning they had to respond to a text from their master within 60 seconds, 24 hours a day. If they failed, they were punished with beatings or more, starvation. This was a sophisticated program of identity erasure. The India Oxenberg who entered NXYVM was gone. In her place was a gaunt, terrified vessel for Raniere's will. The pathology of the DOS branding ritual represents the final collapse of the Bronfman protection. Samuel Bronfman had built his empire to protect his family from the pogroms of Russia, from the violence of the street. 3 generations later, his granddaughter's fortune was funding a pogrom of the soul in upstate New York. The Seagram fortune was paying for the cauterizing pens. It was paying for the silence of the doctors. It was paying for the destruction of women's bodies. The revelation of the branding is the moment where the listener/reader loses the capacity for neutrality. Financial crimes can be rationalized, cult dynamics can be debated, but the smell of burning flesh is an absolute. It is the line that divides a controversial group from a criminal atrocity. When Sarah Edmondson, one of the branded women, finally looked in the mirror and realized she was wearing Keith Raniere's initials, the spell began to break. The pain of the burn eventually overcame the numbness of the brainwashing. We see the ultimate fruition of the Bronfman investment, a group of starving branded women holding each other down while a doctor burns them. This is what the $150 million bought. It didn't buy enlightenment. It bought a branding iron. And as the smoke clears, the question is no longer, how did this happen? But how do we stop it? The empire has become a slaughterhouse, and the screams are finally beginning to leak out from behind the soundproof walls that Claire Bronfman paid for. The DOS sorority was intended to be a lifelong commitment, a permanent chain, but the arrogance of marking human beings like property would prove to be Raniere's fatal mistake. The brand was indelible evidence. You can shred documents, you can hide money in offshore trusts, but you cannot hide a scar that screams the name of the perpetrator. The flesh itself would become the star witness. The architecture of a secret society, much like the architecture of a lie, relies entirely on the structural integrity of silence. For over a decade, Claire Bronfman had used the Seagram fortune to purchase that silence, erecting a fortress of non-disclosure agreements, litigation threats, and financial dependency around Keith Raniere. She believed that her money was an invincible shield, capable of deflecting the curiosity of the press and the scrutiny of the law. However, forensic history teaches that no amount of capital can perpetually suppress the truth when the crime involves the violation of the human body. The branding ritual, detailed in the previous chapter, was the structural stress fracture that would bring the entire edifice crashing down. The finale of the Bronfman dynasty is not a story of a slow decline. It is a chronicle of a catastrophic, rapid collapse triggered by the one force Claire Bronfman could not sue into submission, the primal rage of a mother fighting for her child. By 2017, the rot at the center of NXIVM was no longer containable. The enforcer had successfully silenced many critics, but she had underestimated Catherine Oxenberg, a star of the iconic 1980s soap opera dynasty. Oxenberg was genuine Hollywood royalty. But more importantly, she was the mother of India Oxenberg, one of the young women who had been starved and branded in the DOS sorority. Unlike the other parents who had been cowed by Claire's legal threats or confused by Raniere's pseudo-philosophy, Oxenberg recognized the pathology of the group immediately. When she saw her daughter, gaunt, losing hair, and speaking in the robotic cadence of the cult, she declared war. This conflict, which played out in the media and the courts throughout 2017 and 2018, can be viewed as the War of the Mothers. On one side was Catherine Oxenberg, fighting to extract her biological daughter from a house of horrors. On the other side was Claire Bronfman, the surrogate mother of the cult's finances, fighting to keep the slaves within the walls. It was a clash between biological instinct and ideological indoctrination. Claire unleashed her standard playbook. She threatened legal action. She mobilized the cult's PR machine to paint Oxenberg as an abusive, fame-seeking mother, and she burned through millions of dollars to maintain the perimeter. But Oxenberg possessed a weapon that Claire's money couldn't neutralize: the truth and the willingness to shout it from the rooftops. Oxenberg joined forces with Frank Parlato, a former NXIVM publicist turned whistleblower who ran a blog, The Frank Report, which had been documenting the cult's abuses for years. Together, they began to dismantle the wall of secrecy. But the fatal blow came from inside the branding room itself. Sarah Edmondson, a Canadian actress and a high-ranking member who had been branded, experienced a moment of waking clarity. The physical pain of the scar, combined with the realization that she was wearing Keith Raniere's initials, shattered the hypnotic hold of the indoctrination. In a supreme act of bravery that risked devastating retaliation from the Bronfman legal army, Edmondson walked into the offices of the New York Times. On October 17, 2017, The dam broke. The New York Times published the expose titled "Inside a Secretive Group Where Women Are Branded." The article was a forensic masterclass, laying out the details of the starvation, the blackmail, and the cauterizing pens. It featured a photograph of the brand on Edmondson's skin, undeniable physical proof of the atrocity. The impact was nuclear. Overnight, NXIVM transformed in the public consciousness from a quirky self-help group for the wealthy into a sadistic sex cult. The article stripped away the veneer of executive success and revealed the medieval torture chamber underneath. For Claire Bronfman, this was the moment where reality finally pierced the bubble of her delusion. But instead of waking up, she doubled down. Forensic analysis of her financial activity during this period reveals a woman in the grip of a fanatical fever. As the authorities began to circle and members began to flee in droves, Claire did not cooperate with law enforcement. Instead, she financed the escape. She became the logistics officer for a fugitive run. Keith Raniere, realizing his empire was collapsing, fled to Mexico. He did not go alone. He was accompanied by his most loyal slaves and supported by the Bronfman checkbook. Claire Bronfman stayed behind in the United States to manage the fallout, but she continued to wire vast sums of money to Mexico to support Raniere's life on the run. She funded a luxury villa in Puerto Vallarta, where Raniere attempted to reconstitute the cult in exile. He continued to demand loyalty and sexual servitude from the women he had trafficked across the border, all while Claire paid the rent. This period demonstrates the absolute depth of her complicity. Even when the world knew he was branding women, even when the FBI was opening a file, Claire Bronfman was still signing the checks. She was willing to become a fugitive financier rather than admit she had been conned. The collapse reached its kinetic climax in March 2018. Mexican authorities, working in conjunction with the FBI, raided the villa in Puerto Vallarta. The footage of the arrest is pathetic and telling. Keith Raniere, the self-proclaimed smartest man in the world, the judo champion, the vanguard who demanded absolute courage from his followers, was found cowering in a walk-in closet. He did not fight. He surrendered with a whimper. He was deported to the United States to face justice. The arrest of Claire Bronfman followed in July 2018. It was a spectacle that shook the high society of New York. The heiress to the Seagram fortune was taken into custody, charged with racketeering, conspiracy, identity theft, and money laundering. The courtroom sketch of her arraignment showed a woman who looked small, pale, and utterly defeated. However, the true measure of her continued power and her continued danger was revealed during the bail hearing. The judge set her bond at a staggering $100 million. It was one of the largest bail amounts in U.S. history, a testament to the flight risk posed by a woman with access to untraceable offshore wealth and a private jet network. Claire posted the bond, securing her release to house arrest, but the golden cage had finally become a literal one. The legal proceedings that followed were a slow-motion autopsy of the Bronfman legacy. While Keith Raniere went to trial in 2019 and was convicted on all counts, Claire Bronfman chose a different path. In April 2019, she entered a guilty plea. She pleaded guilty to conspiracy to conceal and harbor illegal aliens for financial gain and fraudulent use of identification. By pleading guilty, she avoided the spectacle of a public trial where the full extent of her financing of the sex cult would be paraded before a jury. However, the plea deal revealed a disturbing psychological truth. Claire Bronfman refused to cooperate against Keith Raniere. Unlike the other high-ranking women, Allison Mack, Lauren Salzman, who flipped on the leader and testified about his abuses to secure lighter sentences, Claire remained loyal to the bitter end. She refused to denounce him. In her statement to the court, she admitted to mistakes, but framed them as administrative errors or lapses in judgment rather than acknowledging the systemic evil she had funded. She expressed love for Raniere even as he was being shackled. This silence was her final act of enforcer loyalty. She would go to prison rather than betray the man who had destroyed her life. It was the ultimate manifestation of the sunk cost fallacy. She had invested her soul, her reputation, and her fortune in him, and she could not bear to liquidate that investment. The sentencing hearing in September 2020 was the grim finale of the saga. It took place in a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, presided over by Judge Nicholas Garofis. The atmosphere was heavy with the ghosts of the past. 9 victims stood up to give impact statements detailing the lives that Claire Bronfman had ruined. They spoke of the lawsuits that had bankrupted them, the investigators who had stalked their children, and the terror of living under the shadow of the Seagram fortune. Claire's defense team argued for probation, citing her lack of prior criminal record and her philanthropic intentions. They tried to paint her as a victim, a misguided woman who had fallen under the spell of a master manipulator. But Judge Garofis was not moved. In a blistering sentencing monologue that will be cited in legal textbooks for years to come, he dismantled the poor little rich girl defense. He looked directly at the heiress and delivered a verdict that cut through the legal jargon to the moral core of the case. "You were not just a bystander," the judge told her. "You were the engine." He recognized that while Raniere provided the ideology, Bronfman provided the oxygen. Without her millions, NXIVM would have remained a pathetic basement group in Albany. Her money amplified Raniere's pathology, giving it global reach and the power to destroy. The judge noted that she had used her wealth not to uplift, but to intimidate and silence. He sentenced her to 81 months, nearly 7 years, in federal prison. This was significantly higher than the sentence recommended by federal guidelines, a rare judicial rebuke that signaled the severity of her enabling role. She was also fined $500,000 and ordered to pay $6 million in restitution to a victim. As Claire Bronfman was led out of the courtroom to begin her sentence, the magnitude of the tragedy settled over the room. The Bronfman dynasty, which had begun with a bootlegger running whiskey across the frozen Canadian border to build a better life for his children, had ended with his granddaughter going to prison for running a sex cult to destroy the lives of others. The cycle was complete, but it was a cycle of degeneration, not evolution. The legacy of the Bronfman family is now irrevocably tarnished. For nearly a century, the name Seagram evoked images of crystal decanters, high-rise buildings, and philanthropic wings in hospitals. Today, in the digital age, a Google search for Bronfman brings up images of branding irons, starving women, and mugshots. Claire Bronfman achieved the impossible. She erased the achievements of a titan. Samuel Bronfman spent his life trying to wash the bootlegger stain from his name. Claire poured indelible ink over it. The forensic accounting of the disaster is staggering. It is estimated that Claire and Sarah Bronfman pumped over $150 million into NXIVM. That money, the liquid gold, distilled from the grain of the prairies and the ambition of an immigrant, was incinerated. It paid for the private jets that trafficked women. It paid for the lawyers who harassed journalists. It paid for the experiments on human subjects. It paid for the townhouse where the branding happened. It is perhaps the most grotesque misuse of inherited wealth in modern history. But the true tragedy lies in the what if. What if Claire Bronfman, the shy girl who loved horses, had found a legitimate mentor? What if the family had provided her with a sense of purpose that didn't require a guru? The Bronfman story is a cautionary tale about the toxic intersection of neglected children and unlimited capital. It proves that wealth without values is not an asset, it is a vulnerability. The money did not protect Claire, it made her a target. It made her useful to a monster. As the doors of the Federal Correctional Institution close on Claire Bronfman, we are left with the silence of the aftermath. The NXIVM Corporation is dissolved. The townhouses in Albany are sold. The Seagram building still stands in Manhattan, a mute witness to the rise and fall of the family that built it. But the brand remains. The scar on the hips of the Wyman of Doss will not fade. It is the final, enduring seal of the Bronfman legacy, a legacy that began with the promise of gold and ended with the smell of burning flesh. The generational curse was not broken. It was fulfilled. The empire has fallen, and all that remains is the cautionary tale of how a kingdom built on shadows was finally swallowed by the dark.